Hospitality Meets is brought to you by RotaCloud, the simple workforce management software for hospitality teams. RotaCloud lets you create and share rotas, record attendance, and manage your team's annual leave, all in less time than it takes to make a brew. It can also make life easier for your staff, allowing them to check their rotas, request holiday, and even pick up extra shifts, all through the RotaCloud mobile app. Start your 30-day free trial today by visiting rotacloud.com/Phil and find out how much easier managing your team can be. Welcome to Hospitality Meets with me, Phil Street, where each week we take a light-hearted look into the stories and individuals that make up the wonderful world of hospitality. Today's guest is Roddy Watt, founder of Buell Hospitality and hospitality industry legend. Coming up on today's show, Roddy hints that he likes being busy.
I'm very busy. I'm always very busy. Even if I'm not busy, I make myself busy.
Phil tests everyone's hearing. Why did nobody tell me that? And Roddy retells a particularly hellish period of his life.
As an experience, it certainly, sharpens you up a bit.
All that and so much more as we chat through Roddy's epic journey so far. I don't even know where to begin with this chat. Roddy does not pull his punches in places but remains humorous throughout. So please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like and a share wherever you can. Enjoy. And a huge Hospitality Meets welcome. We don't get to say this very often, but to a living legend that is Roddy Watt.
I'm not sure about the legend bit, but anyway, thank you very much for the kind introduction.
I'd probably caught you on the hop with that one, to be fair. But it is, I think there's a lot of people in this industry will know who you are through. You've probably touched a lot of lives in your time, and we'll come on to the reasons why for that as we get through your story. But I'm really, really thrilled that you've decided that that this is a podcast to tell your story on.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. I probably have touched a few lives over the years. I think being involved in recruitment for goodness knows how long, 25, 30 years, you do brush up against quite a few people along the way. So that is probably fair.
Yeah, no doubt. How are you anyway? What's new in your world?
I'm good. I'm very busy. I'm always very busy. Even if I'm not busy, I make myself busy. But no, all good. I hit a bit of a milestone a few months ago when I turned the ripe old age of 70, which is slightly scary. And actually, next weekend, I'm off to Switzerland for a long weekend skiing to celebrate my daughter's 40th birthday. So that's an even scarier milestone, having a daughter who's 40 years old. But anyway, there we go. But no, all good. Thanks very much.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But, it's turned 70, no signs of slowing down. I feel like you're speeding up.
Well, it kind of feels like I'm speeding up a bit, if I'm honest. Having relaunched my advisory business, Buell Hospitality, in August 2024, somebody thought it would be a good idea. It wasn't particularly necessarily me, but here we are sort of 18 months down the tracks, and I've now got, I think at latest count, 57 business partner companies, all of whom demand lots of love and care and attention. And so that's fairly time consuming, in addition to which, obviously, I do quite a lot of advisory work. And we're just building a community, which I can tell you a bit more about if you're interested, of independent hotel owners and operators and investors called Buell Connect. And we're currently sitting at about, 35, 40 members, but I want to grow that to 1,000 over the next 2 or 3 years. So, a lot of moving parts to juggle.
Yeah, no doubt. And, you just, as I kind of just alluded to, it like no sign of your interest in this industry abating.
No, I love the industry. I've been in it in some sort of shape or form all my life. I was born in a hotel, and I was brought up in a hotel, and I studied hotel management at university. Not terribly successfully, it has to be said, but I did. And I've worked in hotels up till 1984 when I started my first business, which was hotel advisory. So I've been associated with the industry really from day one.
Yeah, let's talk about the university, because I remember you and I speaking about this off microphone actually around. I see a lot of my own journey and your journey here, to be fair, around the reasons for going to university were not necessarily centered around the qualification that you would achieve at the end of it. But talk to me about that in terms of, were you one of these guys that were you kind of at that time of your life you had an inkling as to what you wanted to do, but didn't really truly know what you wanted to do?
Um, well, I was originally sort of earmarked to study law because that was what my grandfather had done, and all the rest of it. But I didn't really apply myself at school, and so I didn't get the A levels required to get into Aberdeen, where I was supposed to be going to study law. And thank God I didn't, because I would have been the world's worst lawyer. But that's a sort of an aside. And so I then thought, well, what else could I do? And I thought, well, I live in a hotel. I've been brought up in a hotel, so let's go and study hotel management. But like a lot of young chaps, I thought I already knew it all as I'd lived in a hotel. So arrived at Surrey University, probably in somewhat the wrong frame of mind, aiming for 4 years of partying. But after 1 year, they decided that I'd partied so hard that they probably didn't require my presence any longer. So they hoofed me out.
Oh, wow.
But I did, it's a very long story, but I did end up going back to Surrey because I, by that stage, had worked out what was required to get a degree, and then started to apply myself at least moderately, and did eventually get an honours degree. But yeah, no, I think it's fair to say I probably wasn't the world's greatest student, but I scraped through at the end of the day with a third-class honours degree, which I think is about as low as you can get. But anyway,
Right.
it hasn't held me back.
No, indeed, and I think that's also a wonderful. It's kind of a wonderful message in itself. Is that look? There's no hard and fast way to do this, right? There is, and we do ask so much of young people, and I'm pointing the mirror right at myself here, and to make a decision about what you're going to do with your life. In a lot of cases, long before they're ready to do that. I'm not even sure at age 48 I really know what I want to do with my life, Roddy, to be honest.
Well, I mean, interestingly, the two things really come out of that. The first is that when I actually went to Surrey University, their entry criteria were all based around academic achievement up to that point. So most of my peers on my course all had sort of 3 A's at A level, and I scraped in with a B and a couple of D's because I was a late applicant, having not got the grades required to go to Aberdeen. But the interesting point was that of the 48 or whatever it was students on the course, the three who ultimately bumped along the bottom and scraped a degree at the end of the day were probably the three who went on to actually achieve something in life. And I think that's a little fair on some of my peers, because many of them have done well, but not necessarily in hospitality, I think is the point. And so the alignment of their entry criteria and success in the industry didn't really seem to be there. But the other point is I completely agree with you. I mean, youngsters, whether school age or when they're trying to make that decision about which direction to take their career in, I think it's incredibly difficult. And I've never published it, but I did write the book about how to select how to plan your career, because most people enter their career without any plan whatsoever. And having been involved in recruitment for very many years and seen more CVs than you could shake a stick at, the number of people who had actually embarked on their career with any form of plan, you could virtually count on one hand. And it's the old thing in life: if you don't have a target that you're aiming at, you're very unlikely to get there. I always used to tell people that I was brought up in a hotel in Ballyhoolish on the west coast of Scotland, and there was a dartboard in the public bar, and some wag had put a little sign up beside the dartboard which said, "Aim at nothing and you'll hit it." And that's pretty true.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people set off in their careers, they don't have a plan, and as a result, their movement through their career becomes pretty random. An opportunity comes along, so they grab it. Another opportunity comes along, so they grab it. But actually, they've got no destination in mind, and so they've got nothing to actually consider that opportunity against in terms of, is it getting me any closer to where I'm trying to get to? And of course, you can always change your target as you go along. But so yeah, I spent quite a lot of time helping youngsters, anybody from between the ages of sort of 15 and probably 25, in terms of working out which direction they should go in. Because like anything else in life, if you take a bit of a structured approach to it, you start with the world as my oyster, and you then start to narrow that down using sensible logic. But in terms of, what you like doing, what you're good at doing, what you don't like doing, and what you don't want to do, you can quite quickly narrow it down to sectors of industry that are relevant. I think it's really tough for youngsters. And, there are lots of organizations associated with the hospitality industry that promote the industry as a, a great industry and an industry of first choice. And I think it is. But it's not right for everybody, as was apparent from my peer group at university, the vast majority of whom were far too, academically focused to ever really, and probably many lack the sort of interpersonal skills to ever be successful in a hospitality environment.
Yeah, you could argue it's the greatest skill to have in this industry by a mile.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's a lovely chap called Michael Gray, who he was at some stage the Katie Hotelier of the Year, and he was a senior master in Holden, and he used to run the Churchill Hotel in London for Hyatt International. And I worked with Michael many, many years ago, and he always used to say, it's all about the people. You get the people bit right, and everything else kind of tends to take care of itself.
Yeah, no doubt. And especially in this industry, for sure. It's very people-centric. The whole reason we exist is for people, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
But yeah. So walk us through the next phase of your journey then. You scraped through your degree, got into industry, as it were, and how did it start to kind of start, I suppose, forming from there?
Well, I mean, having done this degree, I thought, well, I probably ought to go into the hotel industry. And I actually have dual nationality by quirk of birth. My mother was American, so I thought I'd like to go and work in America. Anyway, that wasn't particularly practical. But there was one hotel company in those days, and this is 78, I suppose, called the Lex Service Group, whose main business was actually selling Volvo cars. But they happened to own 3 or 4 hotels, some of which were in the States. So I thought, well, if I join this company, then maybe I can transfer to the States with them. But within about 3 months of joining the company, they sold all their American hotels. Right. So that was me kind of high and dry. So I was working at the Carlton Tower Hotel in London, and I just got my head down, and I kind of got on with it. And because I generally get on with people, and I applied myself, I did quite well. And then Hyatt International actually bought the hotel. Well, no, correction, it was actually bought by some American Saudi sheikh, but Hyatt International took the management contract, and so they picked me up, and I was Hyattized, and I was sent to the States to learn how Hyatt did things. And I can always remember the senior executives in Hyatt were always incredibly smartly dressed, and had sort of Gucci shoes and terribly smart suits and all the rest of it. And their suits were always sent separately. They didn't put them in their luggage. They were always sent by courier, so they didn't get creased. Right. I thought this was just a complete nonsense. I mean, coming from the west coast of Scotland and still having heather growing out of my ears, I really couldn't get this. One day I was called in by my boss, who was the food and beverage manager in those days, and he said, Roddy, you really need to smarten up your appearance. If you want to go anywhere in Hyatt International, you need to blow dry your hair. And I thought, blow dry my hair? And he said, you need to have a crease in your suit. And I get that bit. Oh, and by the way, you need to change the way you walk, because you always look like you're in a hurry. And whilst you're at it, you probably ought to change your personality as well. I said, what do you mean change my personality? And he said, well, people seem to either really like you or not like you at all. So I did take that on board. I can remember being really pissed off at the time. But anyway, I don't think I did change my personality, but I did smarten up my appearance a bit. But Hyatt were, they're a brilliant company, and I had a great time with them, and I worked with them in the States, and I worked with them in Europe. I was dispatched to become food and beverage director, or directeur de restauration, at their first hotel in Europe outside of London, which was the Hyatt Regency Nice. And I didn't speak any French. And so I was in a bit of a panic about the whole thing. And I managed to persuade them to let me go to the Berlitz School of Languages. Anyway, it was too little too late. And I can remember arriving in Nice on an airplane, and I sat in the airplane at Heathrow Airport praying that the thing wouldn't take off. Anyway, I eventually arrived in Nice, and I'd been practicing my opening line because somebody was coming to collect me at the airport. And there was somebody holding up a sign that said, Monsieur Watt. And so I said, bonjour, je suis Roddy Watt, je suis très enchanté, fait de votre connaissance. I'd sort of got this one-liner lined up. And this lovely Irishman said, you can relax. He said, my name's Bill Downing. I come from Limerick. Anyway, my entry into Nice was nerve-wracking, to say the least. But, I had a year down there and learnt a lot. And then my mother died and I had to come back to the UK for various reasons to sort out her estate. And I joined actually Sheraton Corporation, as it was in those days, as food and beverage manager of the Sheraton Park Tower in Knightsbridge. The one that looks like a pineapple. But it had a very, very short-lived period there, because very soon after I joined, an erstwhile university friend of mine, who was a very bright guy, approached me and asked me if I would like to go into business with him to set up an advisory company. And I thought, oh my God, I've only just started this job. Anyway, I thought, this is actually what I really want to do. And I went to talk to the general manager of the Sheraton Park Tower. It was a lovely chap called Nicky Bayhard. And I explained what had happened. And he said, Roddy, if that's what you really want to do, get on and do it. I'm certainly not going to stand in your way. And anyway, so I only spent 6 months. I worked out my notice and spent 6 months there. And when I left, he said, you're the best food and beverage manager we ever had. And I was very chuffed by this, but actually I then discovered they'd only really ever had 2 food and beverage managers before me. So I'm not sure it was a great accolade, but I did remain in touch with him. And in fact, sadly, eventually died. And I was at his funeral along with a number of his other acolytes. So, and then I started, that was, I suppose, the start of my entrepreneurial career in 1984. And I set up what was then Barclay Scott Associates to provide advisory services. But on the principle that if you know 10% more than the next guy, you can charge him money to give him the benefit of your wisdom. We set up an advisory business.
Good line. Yeah. When you put it like that, that's the logical brain again. That's I never thought of that. I'm taking business notes here now in terms of how to approach that. But there's nothing like getting a compliment from somebody just as you're walking out the door, right? I had the same situation once. I worked for P&O Cruises for 5 years, and I left as a deputy F&B manager. And the day that I got off was my best mate's wedding. The head of F&B for the whole of P&O was there. And we had a little drink later in the evening. He was chatting to say he was sorry to have lost me to the mainland. And he said, if you'd have just stuck around for a couple of months, you'd have been promoted to F&B manager. I was like, why did nobody tell me that before? There's
a lesson for the learning in there as well, actually, from the point of view of employers. I mean, the number of people over the years in recruitment that I came across who, when you ask the question, why do you want to move? Well, I can't see a way ahead in, the company where I am at the moment. And actually, well, A, if they'd gone to talk to their employer, but B, if the employers were more aware of, the fact that people have ambitions and do want to move on and aren't going to stay doing the same thing forever and a day, there'd probably be more happy people around who had more successful careers. But, that's life. I mean, one of my things I always always used to say to people was, have you spoken to your employer before you start sort of trying to jump ship? And actually, as the years passed, what happened more and more and more was when people went to resign, their employers would come up with, hugely improved offers or packages or whatever it may, or promoted them or whatever it may have been, because, people did begin, when I say people, I mean employers, began to realize the value of the human capital they had, and that it was an awful lot better to hold on to somebody who already knew the ropes and who they already knew than, start a whole process all over again. So in recruitment, we developed this technique, which I don't think we were the only people who used it, but it was called trial closing. And so we trained all of our consultants to say, look, what you need to say to your candidate, this was at the point of offer, or, when they were getting up towards an offer was actually put it to the candidate, look, when you go back to your employer, they are almost certainly going to offer you another £5,000 and they may give you a promotion. How are you going to react to that? And the candidate would say, oh, no, I'm fed up with them. No, I really, really want to move. And we'd take them through this sort of scenario 2 or 3 times. So by the time we actually got them to an offer and said, when you go to resign, this is what's likely to happen for the 3rd time, the candidate said, no, I'm definitely leaving. And then they go back and resign, and the employer wouldn't offer them any more money and wouldn't offer to promote them. So by that stage, they were so pissed off with their employer that there was absolutely no question of them not taking the job. And if the employer did indeed offer them more money, they were kind of committed to the whole process by that stage. So it was quite a useful technique to make sure people actually took jobs.
Yeah, you're triggering me with that, Roddy. I had 20 years in recruitment as well, and the amount of times that you do that, I definitely noticed a tail off in, I'm definitely going to take the job. I'm definitely going to take the job, and then something would happen, and they wouldn't take the job. In any case, that's probably a story for another day. But I think that the really great point in all of this, I think, is you can absolutely stop a lot of this stuff happening just by really good constant communication internally. And I think that is down to the employer to create a safe space that people feel comfortable enough to say, look, I think I'm probably going to need to move on because of XYZ reasons. Maybe there's no growth for me here, whatever that looks like for the individual. Because I think a lot of the time I used to ask the same question around, have you been to your employer to discuss this? And a lot of the time they would say yes, but you could sense that they hadn't, because they didn't feel comfortable to do that. They didn't feel, and actually it's in the company's interests as well to not get in the way of people who are ready to fly as well. That has its own problems, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience today is that many employers these days are much, much more switched on, particularly larger companies. Yeah. But I spend my life in the sort of the independent hotel sector, and an awful lot of owners really don't appreciate the requirements of the people that work for them. Some do. There are some wonderful employers out there. There are lots of wonderful employers out there. But I think an awful lot of people just miss the sort of, do as you would be done by kind of mantra in life, and actually don't recognize the importance of creating what you describe as a safe space and nurturing the talent that they've got within their organizations. And it's normally down to, in my experience, a lack of communication. Yeah. Most independent businesses have pretty poor communication down the line. And I always say to people, look, over communicate rather than under communicate. Just tell people what's going on. The old thing of mushroom management, keep them in the dark and shower shit all over them. It just doesn't work, So, tell people what's going on, have a proper meeting structure in your business, and give them more information, perhaps than you even feel comfortable giving them, because provided you've got the right people in your organization, they will respect that, totally, and they will flourish under that trust. So tell them how the business is performing. Tell them what your targets are. Reward them, encourage them. Sit down with them on a regular basis, whether it's a god awful expression, a pit stop or whatever. But talk to them and tell them what's happening, and people will rise to the occasion. I mean, the other old thing, just going back to my recruitment days, and I still think people make this mistake regularly, is, we would have an employer coming to, recruit food and beverage manager, as we're talking about food and beverage, and say, you'd say, and you'll appreciate this having been in recruitment, so what are your criteria? And they'd give you all these criteria. But I really want somebody who's worked in a 5-star environment, and, they need to have had experience of, multi-unit, multi-outlets and the property and blah, 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 blah. And you'd sit there as a recruiter and actually it is far more important to get the right person, because you can teach them an awful lot of this stuff. And again, the old recruitment mantra, that most people are hired on the basis of their experience and their qualifications, and are fired on the basis of their personality and their attitude. And if you can get people with the right personality and attitude into your business, the rest will take care of itself, provided you give them the support and the communication and you help develop them.
Yeah, totally. And then that you mentioned the word trust. That's where the trust is built, right? You're
Yeah,
as an organization, you've looked after somebody, you've nurtured them, you've built them into something that they weren't when they started with you. I love that phrase. I'd never heard that before. You've got a wonderful turn of phrase, by the way. I'm already loving this around that people are hired for their skills and qualification and fired for personality and attitude. I'd never
yeah,
heard of that, but it just makes, I mean, it just makes so much. That is exactly what happens. That is exactly what
yeah.
happens.
Five-star hospitality means having the right people in the right place at the right time, and that's exactly where RotaCloud can help. RotaCloud is the online platform that makes planning rotas, recording attendance, and managing annual leave easy. Its simple, drag-and-drop interface lets you create and share rotas with your team in minutes, while our built-in budgeting tools mean you'll know exactly how much you're spending on staffing before sending the rota out. RotaCloud also makes life easier for your staff, allowing them to check their rotas, request time off, and pick up extra shifts, all through the RotaCloud mobile app. Start your 30-day free trial today by visiting rotacloud.com/Phil and find out how much easier managing your team can be.
Yeah, no, it is it's true. I mean, if you can get people with the right attitude and the right outlook, and you've got an outgoing personality, if you're in the hospitality sector, that's half the battle. Because those sort of people will learn. They'll be like sponges, and they will develop. And sure, they'll make mistakes. I mean, the other little thing I always say to people who I used to employ is, don't be afraid to make decisions, because we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. Nobody's going to die around here. Just don't make the same mistake again and again and again. But giving them that trust to actually be able to spread their wings, rather than you have to stick to the rule book, and this is what it looks like. And if you want to make a decision, you've got to come and talk to me. I mean, it just you time balls a string around people and around the organization. So I'm a great believer that give people the space to make decisions, accept they're going to screw it up once in a while. But if they're people with the right attitude, they will recover the situation.
Yeah, totally. And I think the attitude can also be a byproduct of the surroundings in which you're in as well, right? You can be affected by stuff that goes on around you in life, but also in the business itself. And so I think there has to be also an element of the business take a look at itself. If people are leaving because their attitude is not where you want it to be, then you've got to do some soul searching yourself as an organization as well to understand whether we may have had some kind of input in that in some way.
But I agree with that. But you also need to develop a clear culture within your organization. One of the first things I always say when I get involved with new businesses, if I'm in a sort of an advisory capacity, is I say, look, what you need to develop is what I refer to as your common direction. And it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of knowing where you're going. But what is our mission? What's our vision? What is our core purpose, and what are our values? Because if those are clear and not just some little piece of paper on a wall somewhere, but people, you can actually imbue that into the people that are working with you. You get tremendous energy because everybody's pointing in the same direction, and they all start working together. And the analogy I give is a journey. Your vision is the point on the map you're trying to get to. Your mission is how you're going to get there. Your purpose, your core purpose, is the reason you're going on the journey in the first place. And your values are the kind of rules that sit around that journey. And as I say to people, you wouldn't set off to go to South Africa without a plan. But make sure you've got a plan to support that. But if everybody in the business is clear about where we're trying to get to, how we're going to get there, why we're going on the journey, and what the rules are, it is amazing how much energy you can get driving in one direction. And most businesses just don't have that. And I remember back in my recruitment days, and we employed quite a lot of people, and we employed a couple hundred people. But in one of our offices, our main office in Godalming in Surrey in those days, we had about 80 people. And people were aligned. We'd really, set a clear structure for people to work in, clear vision, mission, values, et cetera, et cetera. And we had one consultant who was probably our highest fee earning consultant. And I'm not going to mention his name, but if he ever happened to hear this, I'm sure he would know who he was. And he was very, very adept at shoehorning people into jobs. But he completely drove a coach and horses through the vision, the mission, the values, and everything else. And eventually, we had a deputation, myself and my business partner, we had a deputation of some of the more senior people in the organization who said, listen, if you don't get rid of this guy, we're going to have to go, because we cannot work with this guy, because he has no respect for what we're trying to do as an organization. And it was one of the more difficult decisions we had to make to actually let this guy go, or otherwise hoof him out the door, as one of our highest fee earners. But he was just sailing completely contrary to everything else we were trying to do as an organization. We did get rid of him, and the energy that came from the rest of the people in the organization as a consequence of that was just extraordinary.
Yeah. I mean, power. Lots of similarities with elite sports teams who, the likes of Real Madrid, who just hire superstars who seem to be, I mean, we don't know the full story, of course, but they just seem to give off this feeling that they're in it for themselves. They're not really in it for the team.
Yeah.
And similar circumstances can be really, really, it just ruptures everything. No cohesion, no clear common direction, and all of that, other than maybe winning in their case. But I think if you're a win at all costs, then it's very difficult to join a team.
Yeah.
Especially if you're values led and you've got a very clear vision on how you're going to get there.
Yeah.
Or what you're working towards. Anyway, I'm properly going off piste here, but we haven't even I think we were at 1984 in your journey. We've got a couple of years to go yet. But how did it progress? You started Barclay Scott Advisory. Talk us through that phase of your life.
Well, I mean, effectively what happened was we very quickly, my business partner and I quickly worked out that the main problem that people had were people, either a lack of, or they had the wrong people, or their issues were people-centric. And so we very quickly, within a year, set up a recruitment company. And the tail very quickly ended up wagging the dog. And we sort of wound up our advisory services and became a recruitment company. And that was in the days when there weren't very many recruitment companies around, and there certainly weren't very many good recruitment companies around. I think there was a business called Hocaps, and there was another one called Profile, and that was about it.
God,
anyway, I mean, we sort of, we grew and grew and grew. We were keen young men, and we worked hard, and we wanted to do a good job, and we built what became the market leading recruitment company, initially as a management recruitment company, but we then branched out we sort of pushed up the ladder into executive search, and sort of down the ladder into rank and file, and we ended up employing in excess of 200 people, and we had 15 offices across the UK. And then we fell into the hands of rogues and charlatans. We brought some venture capital funding in to enable us to make an acquisition, and that was really the beginning of the end. And
right.
I mean, it's a very long story, but ultimately I had a gun put to my head by these venture capitalists, and RBS had a big hand in this as well, and they played very fast and loose. It was at the time that they were just pushing businesses under, and these guys basically put a gun to my head and said, sell the company. And I said, well, I don't want to sell the company. It's not the right time. This was sort of early noughties, I suppose. And they said, well, if you don't want to sell it, float it. And I said, well, I don't want to float the company either. I said, it's completely the wrong time to float the company. Never forget this chap, with apologies to your listeners. This revolting man, and I don't mind saying who he was, a chap called Michael Jackson, who was well known in the city in those days. He turned around to me and he said, Roddy, what you don't seem to understand is there are two partners in every transaction. There's the fucker and the fucky, and you are the fucky in this transaction. So just fucking float the company. And so, with apologies and lots of bleeps and all the rest of it, I had no option. So I was forced into floating the company, which we finally did in 2004 on the AIM market at the London Stock Exchange. Timing was awful. Our nominated advisors got themselves into trouble just as we were coming up to float, because they'd floated so many businesses that the regulator had sort of clamped down them and said, whoa, some of these businesses you're bringing to market aren't up to it. We got completely caught in the crossfire. And anyway, the rest was history, if you like. But we did float the company at the third attempt, because we kept coming up to float. And then our nominated advisors would say, no, we're going to pull the float. It's the wrong timing. And then we went again and again. And the net result was, we were a business showing profits of about £1 million. Well, the actual fees for the flotation were £1 million. So we had a bit of an uphill battle coming off the back of that. And it wasn't helped by the fact that our reporting accountants, who were a firm who I won't mention, but they were a Magic Circle firm, had completely screwed up our financial projections, and they'd failed to connect the cash flow and the profit and loss. And none of us actually realized this, including our finance director, because we kind of assumed they knew what they were doing. And what had happened was, because the float was pulled on 2 occasions, the financial circumstances and situation of the company had changed a bit between, these were, 3 or 4 months apart, I suppose, had changed a bit between each of these. So we floated with a set of accounts that were just nonsense, really. And I can remember we finally floated it just before Christmas, and that was great. We all breathed a huge sigh of relief. And the first week in January, I went off skiing. And about day 3 of my skiing holiday, I had a phone call from our finance director who said, Roddy, we seem to have a problem with cash flow. And I said, well, how could we possibly have a problem with cash flow? We've just raised £3 million, or I can't remember how much it was, but it was quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I don't know. He said, but we're running out of cash. I thought, oh, my God. Anyway, that's when this all started to come to light. Anyway, this poor chap then had a nervous breakdown. He had to go off the Priory. I had to come back from holiday, and I walked into his office to find, this office 12 by 12, literally knee deep in paper. And this poor chap had been trying to work out what on earth had happened and what had gone wrong. And it was the reporting accountants. And I can remember phoning our lawyers and saying, listen, this is what's happened. We've got a bit of a problem here. And she said, well, this is pretty serious, because, you've just floated a company and you've signed your name to the fact that, this is the financial situation of the business, and it clearly isn't. And I said, well, yeah, I'm kind of aware of that. And she said, well, I'm going to ask you one question and be very careful how you answer this. So I said, right. And she said, do you think you can get through this cash flow pinch? So I thought about this and I said, yes, I think we probably just about can. And she said, right answer. She said, if you'd said no, I would have had to report you to the authorities and you could have ended up, banged up. And anyway, we did. We squeaked through, and that was fine. And we came through the other end. But as an experience, it certainly, sharpens you up a bit. And this lovely man who I mentioned earlier was one of the most unpleasant people I've ever come across in my life, and made my life a misery. And eventually, through skullduggery, through insider dealing, all sorts of things, I eventually lost control of the company completely and exited in 2007. But that's for a pint of beer one day, I can tell you. But I could literally have written a book about it. I mean, the whole thing was a nightmare. So there I was in 2007, without Scooby-Doo as to what to do, pretty much cleaned out, and with a publicly quoted company, share price dropped from 75p or whatever it was when we floated to 1.5p. So my, what was supposed to be my nest egg was worth absolutely nothing. So I wasn't quite sure what to do. So I then thought, right, the answer is build a portfolio of non-exec director, engagements. And I thought, having been through what I'd been through, I probably had a bit of wisdom that I could bring to other people. Anyway, I rapidly discovered over a period of about 2 years of building this portfolio that I was probably the world's worst non-executive director, because, what in an SME type environment, the guy who owns the company should be the entrepreneur, and the last thing they want is another non-exec who's an entrepreneur. I mean, that's just doesn't really work.
Yeah.
They want somebody who's just going to ask them the difficult questions and perhaps give them a bit of advice. Anyway, I decided this just was not for me. So I then thought, what do I do now? And so this was about 2010 or 11, I should think. I did have this great day, actually, the last day of Barclay Scott, when we had this general meeting. This was when I knew I was going to lose the company, and we had this vote, and through this insider dealing and a whole lot of other skullduggery, these venture capitalists had managed to get hold of or talk for more of the equity than I could sort of mount defense against. So the day before this was due to happen, I'd gone to have lunch with my financial PR company to say goodbye to them because I knew what was about to happen. And on the way back, I was stopped by the police, having sort of climbed off the train after a good lunch, driving home, and unfortunately was breathalyzed. So that wasn't great. And so I knew I was going to lose my license. And then the next day, I had this general meeting and literally had to hand over the keys to the business. I think that was on the Thursday. And on the Saturday, I was out riding my horse and I was jumping a jump and I fell off my horse and broke my back. So in 1 week, I lost my driving license, lost my company, and broke my back. And I can remember waking up the Sunday morning thinking, blimey, that was a week. And this was at the time the Queen was talking about annus horribilis. And I thought, well,
that was a week.
Probably had the worst week that anybody's ever going to have. But anyway, so it could only go one way from there. But yeah, so in 2011, I guess it was, I sat down and thought, what am I going to do? And I worked out that my black book was probably my intellectual property because I knew an awful lot of people. And more importantly, I knew who the good guys were and who the not so good guys were. And so I approached some of the good guys, some of the great and good in the industry, and said, look, I think there's an opportunity to set up an advisory business in the hospitality, particularly the independent hotel sector. And that's what we did. And that was the sort of launch of Buell, which was 2012, I think. But I did something slightly different, and I invited some of the businesses which I'd done business with over the years, of marketing agencies and procurement businesses and so on, to come and join the party. And so I built this stable of companies. In those days, some of them, I wasn't very particular about who joined or as particular as I should have been. Some of them weren't as good as they should have been. So it was very difficult to develop the trust between them. But so we had this advisory business with the support of all these companies that we could bring into play as required. And that rolled on for a few years. And then about 2015, I was getting quite frustrated that a lot of the businesses we were dealing with, it didn't really matter how much you prodded or cajoled or advised, they were just kind of never going to get there because they didn't have the fundamental understanding of what running a hotel was about. And these are they're complex businesses with a lot of moving parts. And so I set up something called a hotel management company, so we could say to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, look, why don't you just let us run your business for you? So we did that. And then out of that, in 2016, one of my clients highlighted an opportunity in the North Highlands of Scotland where there are quite a lot of hotels, and there are some very good hotels, but there are also some hotels that aren't great. And it's an area that's was generally pretty underserved in terms of quality of accommodation, service, food and beverage, and so on and so forth, with some notable exceptions.
Yeah.
And so I developed a strategy to launch what became Highland Coast Hotels. And it was a very simple strategy: acquire 6 or 8 hotels around the North Highlands of Scotland, broadly speaking, following what many people know as the North Coast 500 touring route these days, to invest heavily in these properties. So acquire underinvested properties, invest in them, reposition with a common direction as high quality, 4-star product, country house by style, good food and beverage offer, good service, all under common management, systems, processes, and so forth. And that was what I did. And COVID kind of got in the way, but we then we launched Highland Coast Hotels in the spring of 2021 as we came out of COVID with the acquisition of the first 4 properties. We acquired 2 more in 2022, and then we acquired another one in 2024. Yeah, so that was the launch of Highland Coast Hotels, which is doing very well. And I always tell people I'm quite good at starting things, but I'm not very good at finishing them. Yeah. And so it was always part of the plan that I was going to hand over the reins, which I did in 2023 as chief executive, but I remained on to help them complete the acquisition program and the refurbishment, redevelopment program of the hotels. And I sort of gradually exited. And then at the end of 24, they said, look, about this stage, somebody said to me, why don't you relaunch Buell again? And I thought, oh, God, really? Anyway, I was persuaded. And so I relaunched Buell in August 24. And in late 24, the guys at Highland Coast, the board said, look, Roddy, you're really sort of in conflict here because you're advising people who, could be or are competitors of Highland Coast, which was a fair cop. And so I stepped off the board in early 25. So today I'm independent as Buell Hospitality. I have 2 co-directors. We have a great time, and we help all sorts of businesses develop opportunities within the hospitality sphere.
Right, yeah. I need to take a breath.
So do I. I'm a puff on my vape.
What an incredibly uneventful life you've had, Roddy. Jeez Louise.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
Really interesting though around, I mean, there's so many questions. I've probably got way more questions than time left, but that whole, I mean, I can't even comprehend what you must have been going through in that period whereby you'd built something that was pretty spectacular in the space in which it operated in. I don't think there would have been many people at that time who did not know who Barclay Scott were, for sure. And then, you know, to have that lovely chap, what a wonderful gentleman he sounds. You know, I suppose that's the difference of the that world, if you like, and the world of hospitality. We're a world of people who genuinely give a monkeys about the things that they do, whereas these guys seem to just focus purely on the only outcome that matters is who's going to get rich at the end of it. And that coming together, really, it doesn't work. You need a bit bigger vision than that. But I'm only saying that from an outsider looking in. I've got zero experience of that whatsoever. But by God, I can only imagine. And then to have that week of your life where everything just, I guess, felt like it was probably unraveling.
Yeah, it wasn't a good week. That has to be said. But, you know, I had a lot of good friends. I still have a lot of good friends, and people were incredibly supportive. And you get through these things. And, you know, nobody died, and, you know, worse things happen at sea. So you just, but resilience is a quality worth having. And I think, you know, I'm pretty resilient. I think you have to.
Is there any doubt about
that? You just sort of do have to be fairly resilient as an entrepreneur. And, you know, there are very few entrepreneurs in life who, for whom it is plain sailing. You know, most entrepreneurs have, you know, carry a few scars along the way, which they've picked up along the way.
Yeah.
But if you've got the right, you know, I mean, it's a dreadful expression, you know, PMA, positive mental attitude. But, you know, if you do have a positive outlook, there is a bit of a challenge in sitting there, you know, at ground-based zero and thinking, right, well, I've got to start again, you know, and the only way is up.
What choice you have?
You know,
that's the thing, right?
Well, yeah, probably a couple of times, really. But yeah, no, it's I mean, it's been fun, and that's why I enjoy being with people. I'm I guess extrovert by nature, and enjoy a good party, and you know, well, the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, some rules don't change, eh? You can take the lad out of the west of Scotland, but you can't take the west of Scotland out of the lad. Is that the?
Well, there's probably an element of truth in that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I say that as somebody who spent his secondary schooling on the west coast of Scotland, so I come from the voice of experience with that one. But wow, I mean, what a story! Obviously not finished yet. As well, you've got, you know, you're still in the midst of Buell and everything that brings to the party as well. What I think, I'm probably just going to wrap this up by. It feels almost full circle if you think about it, because of, you know, that beginning that you had around, you know, going to university, not necessarily having your attitude aligned with what was required, but then look at what your life has done in terms of, you know, I think it's safe to say that you've gotten over the attitude thing. You know, it's now what's possible rather than I can't be arsed.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And no, a wonderful story. I'm so grateful that you've come and spent some time on the show, because I think also this was one of the objectives of this show. We're a positive show and we love to showcase great things, but there's a lot of great things come on the back of bad things as well, you know, and that's as important as just being lovely and fluffy and positive about everything. It's pretty rare that somebody gets through their life with just one straight, lovely, fluffy line of wonderfulness.
Very rare.
And so to hear you kind of talk about that so candidly and openly, I'm very, very grateful for you doing that for us on the show today.
Not at all, Phil. Great pleasure. And if you want episode 2 at some stage, then you know,
I feel like we've left a lot
I'm
out
sure
there,
in
Roddy.
another few years there'll be another few horror stories to tell as well. But,
Absolutely. We'll come and do an anecdote one. We've done your story now, and we'll just do all the anecdotes, all the silly stuff that's happened at some point. But no, thank you so much, Roddy, and wish you all the very best with the next phase.
No, great pleasure, and I hope your listeners enjoy some at least, and perhaps take one or two things away from it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Roddy. Take care.
All the best.
Cheers.
Take care.
And there we have it. Take About Roddy. What a story. Built, tested, knocked down, got back up again, and still building. An absolute joy to have him on the show. We will, of course, be back next week with another awesome journey from hospitality, so have yourselves a cracking week, and I'll see you then.